Judge Rebecca Martinez had always been an early riser, but on her ranch she woke up for different reasons than she did in the city. Instead of preparing for court cases and legal briefs, she stepped outside to breathe in the fresh morning air and listen to the sounds that had become her daily soundtrack. The gentle lowing of her cattle, the creek bubbling over rocks, and the occasional whinny from her two horses created a symphony that no courtroom could ever match. Her ranch stretched across 43 acres of rolling hills in Pine Valley, about an hour's drive from the federal courthouse, where she had spent the last 28 years making some of the most important legal decisions in the state. But here, surrounded by oak trees and wildflowers, she wasn't Judge Martinez. She was just Becca, the woman who fixed fences, fed animals, and found peace in the simple rhythm of ranch life. The centerpiece of her property was something most people drove right past without noticing. An old stone bridge crossed Miller's Creek, connecting the main part of her land to the eastern pastures where she kept her cattle during the summer months. The bridge looked like something from a fairy tale, with its weathered limestone blocks and graceful arch that reflected perfectly in the slow-moving water below. Most visitors assumed the bridge was just another pretty feature of an old ranch, but Rebecca knew its real story. Her great-grandfather had bought this land in 1920, but the bridge was already there, built by the original settlers in 1892. Back then, it served as the main crossing point for families traveling between the towns of Pine Valley and Cedar Creek. Wagon wheels had worn smooth grooves in the stone, and if you looked closely, you could still see where metal horseshoes had struck sparks from the rock over the decades. When Rebecca first inherited the ranch from her grandfather 15 years ago, she had been a newly appointed federal judge, overwhelmed by the responsibility of her position and the weight of the decisions she had to make every day. The ranch had been her escape, but she hadn't really understood its history. That changed when she found a box of old documents in the attic of the farmhouse, including letters, photographs, and survey maps that told the story of not just her family, but the entire community. That's when she learned that her bridge wasn't just old, it was historically significant. The structure had been built by Italian stonemasons who had come to America specifically to work on the railroad. When the railroad project ended, they had stayed in the area and built bridges, buildings, and walls that still stood more than a century later. Her bridge was one of only 3 remaining examples of their craftsmanship in the entire state. Rebecca had always been thorough in her research. Whether she was preparing for a court case or learning about her family history, she spent months tracking down information about the bridge, visiting local historical societies, and even finding descendants of the original builders. What she discovered amazed her. The bridge had been used as a stop on the Underground Railroad, with a hidden compartment beneath the stone arch where freedom seekers could rest during their dangerous journey north. Recognizing the importance of preserving this piece of history, Rebecca had quietly worked to get the bridge listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The process took 2 years, involving archaeologists, historians, and preservation specialists who documented every stone and measured every angle. When the designation finally came through, Rebecca felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had ensured that this bridge would be protected for future generations, just as her great-grandfather had protected the land around it. But Rebecca kept this information mostly to herself. She wasn't the type of person who liked to make a big deal about her accomplishments, whether in the courtroom or on the ranch. Her neighbors knew her as a friendly woman who raised a few cattle and horses, who always waved when she drove by, and who occasionally helped out at community events. They had no idea that she spent her weekdays making federal court decisions that sometimes affected thousands of people, or that her quiet ranch held such an important piece of local history. The ranch had become her sanctuary over the years. After particularly difficult court sessions, especially those involving serious crimes or complex constitutional issues, Rebecca would drive out to Pine Valley and spend hours walking her property. She would often end up sitting on the bridge, letting her feet dangle over the edge while she watched the water flow beneath her. The sound of the creek and the feeling of the old stones beneath her hands had a way of putting even the most challenging legal problems into perspective. Her routine was simple and comforting. Every morning she would walk down to check on the cattle, making sure they had enough water and that the fences were secure. Then she would cross the bridge to the eastern pasture, where she kept her horses, Thunder and Rosie. Thunder was a gentle giant, a former police horse who had been retired to her care, while Rosie was a rescue mare who had learned to trust humans again under Rebecca's patient care. The neighbors in Pine Valley had always been friendly but distant. Most of them were working families, people who commuted to jobs in the city or worked the land themselves. They respected privacy and minded their own business, which suited Rebecca perfectly. She could work in her garden, repair her equipment, and care for her animals, without feeling like she was being watched or judged. That peaceful existence began to change about 3 years ago, when developers started building new homes on the hills surrounding her ranch. What had once been quiet countryside gradually filled with large houses and manicured lawns. The new residents were different from the original Pine Valley families. They commuted to high-paying jobs in the city, drove expensive cars, and seemed to have very specific ideas about how a neighborhood should look. At first, Rebecca didn't mind the changes. She figured that growth was inevitable, and as long as her own property remained untouched, she could adapt to having more neighbors. The new residents seemed nice enough when she encountered them at the grocery store or gas station. They would smile and make polite conversation about the weather or comment on how lovely her horses looked. The trouble started when someone decided that all these new expensive homes needed to be managed as a community. Rebecca received a letter in the mail one day informing her that the Pine Valley area was being organized into a homeowners association. The letter explained that this would help maintain property values and ensure that the neighborhood continued to look its best. Rebecca had some experience with homeowners associations from her legal work. She had presided over several cases involving disputes between homeowners and their associations, and she knew that these organizations could be helpful when run properly, but could also become sources of serious conflict when they overreached their authority. The letter assured her that existing properties would be grandfathered in and that the association was mainly concerned with new construction and basic community standards. Since Rebecca's ranch had been in her family for generations and she maintained it well, she didn't see any reason for concern. She signed the papers and sent in her annual dues, thinking that would be the end of it. For the first year, the Homeowners Association seemed to live up to its promises. Rebecca received newsletters about community events and notices about road maintenance, but no one bothered her about her property or tried to tell her how to manage her ranch. She even attended a few community meetings, though she kept quiet about her profession and just listened to discussions about playground equipment and snow removal services. Looking back, Rebecca realized that this peaceful period was just the calm before the storm. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a crisp white envelope with the Pine Valley Homeowners Association logo embossed in gold. Rebecca found it tucked into her mailbox on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a feed store catalog and her electric bill. She almost tossed it aside with the other routine mail, but something about the formal presentation made her pause. Inside was a letter introducing the new HOA board president, Dale Morrison, and outlining his vision for community excellence. Like the letter was full of corporate buzzwords about maximizing property values and implementing comprehensive aesthetic standards. Rebecca had seen enough legal documents to recognize aggressive language dressed up in polite terms, and this letter definitely fell into that category. Dale Morrison had moved to Pine Valley 6 months earlier, purchasing one of the largest houses in the new development. He was a retired corporate executive who had spent 30 years climbing the ladder at a major consulting firm, and he apparently viewed the Homeowners Association as his next conquest. The letter mentioned his experience managing large teams and implementing systematic improvements in organizational efficiency. Rebecca's first face-to-face encounter with Dale came 3 weeks later, when she spotted a man in pressed khakis and a polo shirt walking around her property, with a clipboard and a measuring tape. She had been mucking out horse stalls when she noticed him, and she walked over to see what he was doing. "Can I help you?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. Dale looked up with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to being in charge. He was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man who was used to getting his way. "You must be Rebecca. I'm Dale Morrison, the new president of the Pine Valley HOA. I was just conducting a routine property assessment to ensure we're all in compliance with community standards." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten slightly. She had dealt with enough entitled individuals in her courtroom to recognize the type immediately. "I wasn't aware that anyone had permission to walk around my property," she said calmly. "Oh well, as HOA president, I have certain responsibilities to ensure community standards are maintained," Dale replied, consulting his clipboard. "I'm sure you understand. We want to keep property values high for everyone." Rebecca looked at the measuring tape in his hand and the notes on his clipboard. "What exactly are you measuring?" Dale's smile became a bit strained. "Well, I've been reviewing our community standards and I noticed some potential issues that need to be addressed. That old bridge, for instance." He gestured toward the stone structure. "It's not really in keeping with the aesthetic we're trying to maintain here in Pine Valley." "That bridge has been there since 1892, Rebecca said, keeping her voice level. "It was built long before this homeowners association existed." "Yes, I'm sure it has some sentimental value," Dale said dismissively. "But you have to understand, we're trying to create a cohesive upscale community here. That old thing just doesn't fit the image we're going for. It looks like something from a history book." Rebecca almost smiled at the irony of his comment, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. "The bridge is functional and well-maintained. It's also part of the historical character of this area." Dale made some notes on his clipboard. "I appreciate your attachment to it, I really do. But we have to think about what's best for the community as a whole. I'm sure once you see our vision for Pine Valley, you'll understand why certain changes need to be made." Over the following weeks, Rebecca began to understand just how comprehensive Dale's vision really was. She received a steady stream of letters from the HOA, each one outlining new standards and regulations that seemed designed to transform Pine Valley into a suburban paradise where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. The first letter complained about her mailbox, which was a simple wooden post with a basic metal box that had served her family for decades. According to the new standards, all mailboxes needed to be black metal with brass numbers and specific spacing from the road. The second letter addressed her gravel driveway, which apparently needed to be paved with approved materials and bordered with landscape lighting. Each letter was signed by Dale and contained language about community, compliance, and maintaining property values. They all included deadlines for making the required changes, along with warnings about fines for non-compliance. Rebecca found herself spending more time reading HOA correspondence than she did reviewing some court cases. The most frustrating part wasn't the demands themselves, although they were unreasonable enough. It was Dale's attitude when she tried to discuss them with him. She attempted to call him several times to talk about the requirements, but he seemed to view every conversation as an opportunity to lecture her about the importance of community standards. "You have to understand, Rebecca," he said during one particularly condescending phone call. "This isn't personal. It's about creating the kind of community that attracts the right kind of residents. People who invest in quality homes expect certain standards to be maintained." "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca replied, "drawing on years of experience dealing with difficult people in professional settings, my property has been well maintained for decades. The previous residents of Pine Valley never seemed to have any complaints." "Well, that's exactly the problem," Dale said. "The previous leadership didn't have the vision or the backbone to enforce proper standards. That's why property values in this area were stagnating. Since I took over, we've already seen improvements in community appearance and market prices." Rebecca wanted to point out that property values had been rising steadily for years due to the area's natural beauty and proximity to the city, but she decided it wasn't worth the argument. Instead, she tried a different approach. "Some of the features you're asking me to change have historical significance," she said. "The bridge, for instance, is actually protected under federal preservation guidelines." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, protected?" Rebecca had to be careful here. She couldn't reveal her position or the specific legal protections without potentially compromising her ability to handle the situation properly. "I mean that there are laws protecting historically significant structures. Before making any changes to properties with historical features, it's important to check whether there might be legal restrictions." Dale's voice took on a sharper edge. "Are you threatening me with some kind of legal action?" "I'm not threatening anything," Rebecca said calmly. "I'm just suggesting that we all need to be careful about understanding our rights and responsibilities before making major changes to established properties." "Listen," Dale said, and Rebecca could hear the irritation in his voice. I've been dealing with homeowners associations for 15 years. I know what we can and can't require. I've got connections with lawyers, city officials, and state regulators. If you think you can intimidate me with vague threats about historical protection, you're barking up the wrong tree. After that conversation, Rebecca realized that Dale wasn't just overly enthusiastic about community standards. He was someone who enjoyed wielding power and didn't respond well to anyone who questioned his authority. She had encountered similar personalities in her legal career. Individuals who confused having authority with being right and who took any disagreement as a personal challenge. The letters from the HOA became more frequent and more demanding. Dale had apparently decided that Rebecca was a problem resident who needed special attention. He began conducting weekly inspections of her property, always armed with his clipboard and measuring tape, always finding new violations of standards that seemed to change with each visit. Rebecca tried to stay patient and reasonable. She attended HOA meetings, where Dale would present elaborate PowerPoint presentations about community enhancement initiatives and property value optimization strategies. She listened to other residents' voice, complaints about his increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics, but she also noticed that most people seemed intimidated by his corporate background and authoritative manner. The turning point came when Dale called a special meeting specifically to address what he termed persistent compliance issues with certain properties. Rebecca knew without being told that this meeting was really about her and her bridge. Dale had prepared a presentation complete with photographs of her property, comparisons to similar communities with higher property values, and cost-benefit analyses of various improvement options. He spoke for nearly an hour about the importance of maintaining community standards and the negative impact that outdated structures could have on property values. When he finally got to the specific issue of Rebecca's bridge, he presented it as a clear-cut case of community welfare versus individual stubbornness. We have a responsibility to all residents to ensure that Pine Valley maintains the highest possible standards, he said, clicking through photos of modern subdivisions with uniform architectural features. We can't allow personal attachments to outdated structures to compromise our collective investment. Rebecca sat in the back of the community center, listening to Dale's presentation and watching the faces of her neighbors. Some nodded along with his arguments, while others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. When Dale opened the floor for discussion, several residents spoke up in support of his comprehensive approach to community management. Finally, Rebecca stood up to speak. She kept her voice calm and professional, drawing on decades of experience addressing groups in formal settings. I appreciate Mr. Morrison's commitment to the community, but I think we need to be careful about understanding the legal implications of some of these requirements. Some structures, particularly older ones, may have protections that limit what changes can be made. Dale's face flushed slightly. As I've mentioned before, Ms. Martinez, I've consulted with legal experts who have confirmed that homeowners associations have broad authority to establish and enforce community standards. If you have specific concerns about legal issues, I'd be happy to put you in touch with our attorneys. I'm simply suggesting that we all do our due diligence before making irreversible changes to historically significant structures. Rebecca replied, What exactly are you claiming is historically significant about an old farm bridge? Dale asked, his tone becoming openly dismissive. We're not talking about tearing down the Washington Monument here. Rebecca felt a flash of anger but kept her expression neutral. Mr. Morrison, I think you'd be surprised by how much history exists in structures that might not look important to the casual observer. The meeting ended with the HOA board voting to give Rebecca 30 days to submit a plan for bringing her property into compliance with community standards, with specific emphasis on addressing the bridge situation. Dale made it clear that failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. The next week felt like the longest of Rebecca's life. After the bridge destruction, she had spent hours on the phone with federal agencies, carefully documenting what had happened and initiating the proper legal processes. As a federal judge, she had to be extremely careful about how she handled the situation, making sure that her personal involvement didn't compromise any potential legal proceedings. She contacted the National Park Service, which oversees the National Register of Historic Places, and filed a formal complaint about the destruction of the protected structure. She called the Environmental Protection Agency to report the damage to the wetlands around Miller's Creek. She also reached out to the FBI, since destruction of federally protected property falls under federal criminal jurisdiction. Each agency took her report seriously, especially when she provided the documentation proving the bridge's protected status. Within 2 days, federal investigators were at her ranch, photographing the destruction, taking water samples from the contaminated creek, and building a case that would eventually land on the desk of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Meanwhile, Dale seemed to be enjoying his victory. He had sent a newsletter to all Pine Valley residents highlighting the successful completion of the bridge removal project and praising the HOA board for taking decisive action to maintain community standards. The newsletter included before and after photos of Rebecca's property, with the bridge destruction presented as a positive improvement to the neighborhood's appearance. Rebecca received several calls from neighbors expressing sympathy for her loss, but also concern about what might happen to their own properties if they crossed the HOA board. Dale had made his point. He was in charge, and residents who didn't comply with his vision for the community would face swift and decisive action. The HOA had scheduled a regular monthly meeting for the following Thursday, and Rebecca decided it was time to attend. She had been quiet long enough, allowing Dale to operate under the assumption that he had successfully intimidated her into submission. The time had come to correct that misunderstanding. The meeting was held in the Pine Valley Community Center, a modest building that had been constructed when the HOA was first formed. About 30 residents attended, which was a larger turnout than usual. Word had spread about the bridge destruction, and people were curious to see how the situation would play out. Dale opened the meeting with his usual corporate presentation style, complete with slides about property values and community standards. He spent the first 20 minutes reviewing various improvement projects that the HOA had completed, with the bridge removal featured prominently as an example of effective enforcement. "I want to emphasize," Dale said, clicking through his presentation, "that maintaining community standards sometimes requires making difficult decisions. We can't allow individual preferences to override the collective good of the community." The bridge removal project is a perfect example of how decisive leadership can address problems that previous boards were unwilling to tackle. Several residents nodded along, though Rebecca noticed that many others looked uncomfortable with Dale's triumphant tone. She recognized the dynamic from her courtroom experience. People often went along with authority figures even when they disagreed, especially when they felt intimidated or unsure of their own rights. Dale continued his presentation for another 15 minutes, outlining new standards for mailboxes, landscaping, and exterior home colors. He seemed to be enjoying his role as the absolute authority on community aesthetics, and Rebecca could see that the power had gone to his head in a way that was becoming dangerous for everyone in Pine Valley. When Dale finally opened the floor for questions, several residents raised concerns about the increasingly strict enforcement and the growing list of required modifications to their properties. Dale dismissed each concern with the same corporate efficiency, explaining that short-term inconvenience was necessary for long-term community improvement. Finally, Rebecca stood up to speak. She had thought carefully about what she was going to say, knowing that this moment would change everything about how she related to her neighbors and how the HOA situation played out. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice calm and professional, "I'd like to address some serious concerns about the bridge removal project." Dale's face immediately took on the dismissive expression she had come to know well. "Ms. Martinez, we've already discussed this issue extensively. The board made its decision based on clear community standards and legal authority. If you have ongoing concerns, I'd suggest you consult with your own attorney." "Actually," Rebecca said, "I'd like to clarify some things about legal authority. Both yours and mine." She paused for a moment, looking around the room at her neighbors' faces. Some looked curious, others seemed worried about potential conflict, and a few appeared eager to see Dale challenged by someone who wasn't intimidated by his corporate background. "First," Rebecca continued, "I should properly introduce myself. I'm Judge Rebecca Martinez, United States District Judge for the Western District." The room went completely silent. Dale's confident expression faltered for just a moment before he recovered his composure. though Rebecca could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to process this new information. "I've been serving on the federal bench for 28 years, Rebecca continued. "And in that time I've handled thousands of cases involving federal law, including laws protecting historically significant structures and environmental regulations." Dale cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the situation. "Well, that's very impressive, Ms. Martinez. But I'm sure you understand that federal courts don't have jurisdiction over homeowners association matters. We're dealing with local community standards here, not federal issues." Rebecca nodded calmly. "You're absolutely right that federal courts don't typically handle HOA disputes. However, federal courts do handle cases involving the destruction of federally protected property." The room was so quiet that Rebecca could hear the air conditioning system cycling on and off. Dale's face was beginning to show the first signs of real concern, though he was still trying to maintain his authoritative demeanor. "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca continued, 3 years ago I had my bridge listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This designation provides federal protection for historically significant structures. Destroying such a structure without proper authorization is a federal crime, punishable by up to 5 years in prison and substantial fines." Dale's face went pale, but he still tried to bluster his way through. "Now wait just a minute. You never mentioned anything about federal protection. You talked about historical significance, but you never said anything about federal registration." "Actually," Rebecca said, "I mentioned multiple times that the bridge might have legal protections. I specifically warned you about federal laws protecting historically significant structures. I urged you to research the legal implications before taking any action. But you never specifically said it was federally registered," Dale protested, his voice rising slightly. "Mr. Morrison, when a federal judge tells you that a structure might be protected by federal law, and you choose to destroy it anyway without doing proper research, that's not my failure to communicate clearly. That's your failure to exercise due diligence." Rebecca pulled out a folder containing documentation she had prepared for this moment. "I've filed reports with the National Park Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the FBI. Federal investigators have already been to my property to document the destruction. The U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing the case for potential criminal charges." The room erupted in whispered conversations as residents tried to process what they were hearing. Dale stood frozen at the front of the room, his confident presentation style completely abandoned as he faced the reality of what Rebecca was telling him. "Furthermore," Rebecca continued, "the destruction of my bridge also damaged protected wetlands around Miller's Creek. The heavy equipment you used contaminated the water and destroyed habitat that's protected under federal environmental laws. These violations carry additional criminal penalties and substantial fines." Dale finally found his voice, though it was shaky and much less confident than usual. I consulted with attorneys. They told me the HOA had authority to enforce community standards." "I'm sure they did," Rebecca said calmly. "But did you tell them about the historical significance of the structure? Did you mention that a federal judge had specifically warned you about potential federal protections? Did you ask them about environmental regulations regarding wetland disturbance?" Dale's silence was answer enough. Rebecca could see that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake, but his corporate instincts were still pushing him to try to maintain control of the situation. "Look," he said, "if there are legal issues here, I'm sure we can work something out. Maybe there was a misunderstanding about the protection status. I'm willing to discuss options for resolving this matter." Rebecca shook her head. "Mr. Morrison, this isn't a civil dispute that can be resolved through negotiation. You've committed federal crimes. The FBI doesn't negotiate about criminal matters." The meeting devolved into chaos as residents began talking among themselves, some asking questions about their own potential liability, others expressing outrage at Dale's reckless actions. Several people approached Rebecca to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Dale's increasingly aggressive tactics. Dale tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was clear that his authority had been completely undermined. When he called for order, residents ignored him. When he tried to move on to other agenda items, people continued discussing the bridge situation. Finally, he gathered his materials and left the meeting early, muttering something about consulting with his attorneys. As Rebecca drove home that night, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was glad that Dale would finally face consequences for his actions, but she couldn't help thinking about her beautiful bridge. now just a pile of rubble in Miller's Creek. No amount of legal justice could bring back something that had stood for 130 years and had witnessed so much history. But she also knew that sometimes, when dealing with people who refuse to listen to reason, you have to speak in a language they understand. Dale had chosen to exercise power without responsibility, and now he was going to learn what real authority looked like. The next few weeks moved with the methodical precision of the federal legal system. Rebecca watched from her unique position as both victim and judge as the various agencies she had contacted began building their cases against Dale and the HOA board. The FBI investigation was particularly thorough. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in federal property crimes, spent 3 days at Rebecca's ranch documenting every aspect of the destruction. She photographed the scattered stones, measured the environmental damage to Miller's Creek, and interviewed Carlos about what he had witnessed during the demolition. "I've seen a lot of property destruction cases," Agent Walsh told Rebecca, "but this one is particularly egregious. The defendant was specifically warned about federal protections by a federal judge, and he chose to proceed anyway. That level of willful disregard for federal law is going to make this case very straightforward to prosecute." The Environmental Protection Agency investigation was equally damning. EPA investigators found that the heavy equipment had destroyed nearly half an acre of protected wetlands, contaminated the creek with diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid, and damaged the habitat of several protected species. The environmental violations alone carried potential fines of over $2 million. Dale, meanwhile, was discovering that his corporate attorneys were not equipped to handle federal criminal law. When the FBI contacted him for questioning, his lawyers immediately advised him to hire a criminal defense attorney and to stop talking to anyone about the case. The Pine Valley community was in turmoil. Residents who had initially supported Dale's community improvement initiatives were now worried about their own liability. Several homeowners contacted Rebecca directly to ask whether they might face legal consequences for supporting the HOA board's actions. Rebecca assured them that federal investigators were focused on the individuals who had made the decision to destroy the bridge and those who had carried out the physical destruction. Regular homeowners who had simply paid their HOA dues and attended meetings had nothing to worry about. However, the HOA itself was facing serious financial and legal problems. Their insurance company conducted its own investigation and quickly determined that the board had acted outside the scope of their authority when they destroyed federally protected property. The insurance policy specifically excluded coverage for criminal acts, meaning that any fines or damages would have to be paid directly by the HOA and its board members. 3 weeks after the bridge destruction, Rebecca received a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Prosecutor David Chen explained that they were preparing criminal charges against Dale and 2 other board members who had voted to authorize the bridge demolition. "We're looking at multiple federal charges," Chen explained. "Destruction of federally protected property, violation of environmental protection laws, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Mr. Morrison is looking at potentially 10 to 15 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts." Rebecca felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. As a judge, she understood the importance of federal laws and the need to prosecute those who violated them. As the victim of Dale's actions, she felt that justice was finally being served. But she also couldn't help feeling some sympathy for a man whose arrogance and ignorance had led him to destroy his own life, along with her bridge. "What about restitution?" she asked. "That's one of the interesting aspects of this case," Chen replied. "Normally, we would require the defendant to pay for repairs or restoration. But in this case, we're dealing with a structure that was 130 years old and had irreplaceable historical value. Our experts estimate that rebuilding the bridge using traditional methods and materials would cost at least $800,000. And even then, it wouldn't have the same historical authenticity as the original." A month after the federal charges were filed, Dale Morrison and his 2 co-defendants were arrested at their homes in early morning raids. The local news covered the story extensively, with headlines like "HOA President Faces Federal Charges for Bridge Destruction" and "Pine Valley Homeowners Association in Crisis" after federal investigation. The arrest was particularly humiliating for Dale, who had built his identity around being a successful corporate executive and community leader. Seeing him led away in handcuffs on the morning news was a stark reminder that no amount of corporate experience or personal wealth could protect someone from the consequences of federal crimes. The legal proceedings moved forward with the efficiency that Rebecca had come to expect from the federal system. Dale's criminal defense attorney attempted to negotiate a plea bargain, but the prosecution wasn't interested in reducing charges for someone who had been specifically warned by a federal judge and had chosen to proceed anyway. Meanwhile, Rebecca had to recuse herself from any federal cases that might involve the defendants or their attorneys. It was an unusual situation for a judge to be the victim in a federal criminal case, but the system had procedures for handling such conflicts of interest. The trial lasted 2 weeks and attracted significant media attention. Rebecca testified about her attempts to warn Dale about the bridge's protected status, and federal experts explained the historical significance of the destroyed structure. The environmental damage was documented in painful detail, with photographs showing the contaminated creek and destroyed wetlands. Dale's defense strategy seemed to focus on portraying him as a well-intentioned community leader who had been misled by inadequate legal advice. His attorney argued that the HOA's lawyers should have warned him about potential federal protections, and that Rebecca should have been more explicit about the bridge's registered status. The prosecution dismantled these arguments methodically. They played recordings of phone conversations where Rebecca had specifically warned Dale about federal laws protecting historically significant structures. They presented testimony from legal experts, explaining that any competent attorney would have advised researching potential federal protections before authorizing the destruction of a 130-year-old structure. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Dale and his co-defendants. Dale received a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay $850,000 in restitution and fines. The 2 other board members received shorter sentences but were also ordered to pay substantial fines. The Pine Valley Homeowners Association was dissolved and reorganized under new leadership. The remaining board members voted to rescind all of Dale's community improvement initiatives and to adopt a more collaborative approach to neighborhood management. They also voted to use the HOA's reserve funds to begin the process of rebuilding Rebecca's Bridge. The reconstruction project became a community effort that brought Pine Valley together in a way that Dale's authoritarian approach never could have achieved. Local historians worked with engineers and craftsmen to design a new bridge that would honor the original while incorporating modern safety features. Rebecca insisted that the new bridge be built using stones from the original structure wherever possible. Masons worked carefully to sort through the rubble, identifying stones that could be reused and fitting them back together like pieces of a historical puzzle. The project took 18 months and cost significantly more than the original estimates, but the community raised additional funds through fundraising events and individual donations. When the new bridge was finally completed, Pine Valley held a dedication ceremony that attracted visitors from across the state. Rebecca spoke about the importance of preserving history and working together as a community to protect shared heritage. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for the original bridge and a commitment to never again allow ignorance and arrogance to destroy something irreplaceable. Brass plaque was installed on the new bridge, reading, "Rebuilt 2027. In memory of the original bridge, 1892-2025, and in honor of those who fight to preserve our shared heritage. May we always remember that some things once lost can never truly be recovered." Rebecca continued to serve on the federal bench for several more years before retiring to her ranch full-time. She often sat on the new bridge in the evenings, watching the water flow beneath her feet and thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought her community together. The story of the bridge destruction became a cautionary tale that was told at HOA, conferences and legal seminars across the country. It served as a reminder that local authority has limits, that federal law applies to everyone regardless of their position or wealth, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in small communities where neighbors must learn to live together with respect and understanding. Dale Morrison served his full sentence and was released on supervised probation. He never returned to Pine Valley, moving instead to another state where he kept a much lower profile. His experience became a stark reminder that leadership without wisdom is just destruction with a title, and that true authority comes not from the power to enforce rules, but from the wisdom to know when those rules serve the greater good. Years later, Rebecca would often tell visitors that the new bridge was beautiful and functional, serving the community well and honoring the memory of the original structure. But she would also remind them that some things once destroyed can never be fully restored. The original bridge had carried 130 years of history in its stones, and no amount of careful reconstruction could bring back the wagon wheels, the underground railroad connections, or the countless families who had crossed those particular stones over the decades. The lesson of Pine Valley wasn't just about federal law or historical preservation. It was about the importance of listening, the danger of unchecked authority, and the irreplaceable value of the things we inherit from previous generations. In a world that often prioritizes the new over the old, the convenient over the significant, Rebecca's bridge served as a reminder that some things are worth fighting to preserve, even when the cost of that fight is higher than anyone could have imagined.